November 1967. The Mekong Delta, somewhere near the Bassac River. Staff Sergeant David Wheeler had been in Vietnam for 11 months. He had seen napalm turn triple canopy jungle into ash. He had watched B-52 strikes erase entire grid squares from existence. He thought he understood what American military power looked like. He was wrong. What stepped off the patrol boat at 0300 that night did not look like any American unit he had ever seen. 6 figures emerged from the darkness. No helmets, no boots, no insignia. Their faces were painted entirely green, like something from a nightmare. One carried a shotgun with the barrel sawed down to illegal length. Another had a Soviet AK-47 slung across his back. The leader wore nothing but cut-off jeans and a bandolier of ammunition. Wheeler's platoon had been pinned down for 6 hours. 32 Marines against an estimated company of Viet Cong dug into the tree line. They had called for air support. They had called for artillery. They had called for reinforcements. Nothing worked. The VC knew exactly where the Marines were, and every attempt to advance had been thrown back with casualties. The green-faced men said nothing. They simply disappeared into the black water of the canal beside the Marine position. No splashes, no ripples, just gone. 18 minutes later, the enemy guns fell silent. All of them. At once. When Wheeler's platoon finally advanced at dawn, they found the VC positions destroyed. Not defeated in conventional combat. Destroyed. Eliminated with a precision that seemed impossible. And in the center of the enemy commander's bunker, pinned to his chest, was a single playing card. The ace of spades. Wheeler grabbed a Navy lieutenant who had arrived with the extraction boats. He demanded to know who those men were. The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment, then answered with 2 words that would haunt Wheeler for the rest of his life. The Viet Cong had another name for them. They believed these Americans could see in total darkness. They believed these men could hold their breath for impossible lengths of time. They believed the green faces could smell fear itself. They were not entirely wrong. But the men who terrorized the Mekong Delta were not born as predators. They were transformed into them. Farm boys from Nebraska, surfers from California, high school athletes who had never imagined they would learn to end lives with a knife in chest-deep swamp water. To understand how ordinary American boys became the most feared hunters of the Vietnam War, we have to go back. Back to the freezing Pacific waters off Coronado. Back to a training program designed to break every man who entered it. Back to the moment when instructors told them the words that would define everything that followed. Quote 2. The night of March 15, 1968, a Viet Cong tax collector named Nguyen Van Thao woke up screaming for the 3rd time that week. His wife would later tell South Vietnamese interrogators that her husband had stopped eating. He had stopped speaking to their children. He spent every night staring at the river through their bamboo window, waiting for them. The men who came from the water. The demons with green faces who had already taken 4 of his comrades in the past 11 days. Not captured in battle. Not gunned down in ambush. Simply vanished. Erased from existence between midnight and dawn, leaving nothing behind but wet footprints and the smell of Mekong mud. 3 days later, Nguyen Van Thao walked into a South Vietnamese outpost and surrendered without a single shot being fired. He was carrying documents that identified 17 other Viet Cong operatives in his district. He gave up everything: names, locations, supply routes, weapons caches, hidden tunnels, safe houses. Every secret he had spent years protecting, handed over in a single afternoon. And when the ARVN intelligence officer asked him why he had betrayed everything he believed in, Thao's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the classified history of unconventional warfare. He said he would rather spend 20 years in a prison camp than one more night waiting for the green faces to come for him. But here's what the official reports never mentioned. Thao was not a coward. He was not weak. He had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu. He had survived American bombing raids that turned entire villages into craters. He had buried friends, family, fellow fighters. This was a man who had stared down death for 2 decades and never flinched. Until the green faces came to his district. And Thao was not alone. Not even close. What happened in the Mekong Delta between 1966 and 1972 remains one of the most deliberately obscured chapters of the Vietnam War. The Pentagon did not want to talk about it. The CIA pretended it never happened. The official histories mention it only in passing, buried under mountains of statistics about bombing tonnage and body counts and all the other metrics that meant absolutely nothing in a guerrilla war. But the Viet Cong knew. They knew exactly what was happening, and they were terrified. The documents captured after the war tell a story that contradicts everything the American public was told about Vietnam. These were not defeated American soldiers fighting a losing war against an invincible guerrilla enemy. These were hunters, predators, men who had learned to fight in ways that the Pentagon never authorized, and the history books still refused to acknowledge. Men who turned the Viet Cong's own tactics against them with such devastating effectiveness that entire districts simply stopped functioning as part of the insurgency. The enemy had a name for these men. They called them, quote, three. And that name, whispered in fear from the Ca Mau Peninsula to the Cambodian border, would become the most powerful psychological weapon of the entire war. But the story of how these men came to exist, how they transformed themselves from clean-cut American sailors into the nightmarish figures that haunted Viet Cong dreams, begins not in Vietnam, but in the freezing waters off Coronado, California. And it begins with pain. The basic underwater demolition training program, known simply as BUD/S, was designed to break men. That was not an accidental byproduct of rigorous training. That was the explicit purpose. The instructors at the Naval Special Warfare Center had studied every elite military selection program in the world, from the British SAS to the French Foreign Legion, and they had concluded that the only way to identify men capable of operating in the most hostile environments on Earth was to push candidates past the point where normal human beings quit. 80% of the men who entered BUD/S would fail to complete it. Many would quit within the first week. Some would suffer injuries that would end their military careers. A few would lose their lives in training accidents that were considered acceptable costs of producing the world's most capable combat swimmers. The centerpiece of this selection process was a period known as Hell Week. 5.5 days of continuous physical activity, with a total of approximately 4 hours of sleep. Candidates would run for miles in soft sand while instructors sprayed them with fire hoses. They would carry 200-pound logs through the surf zone until their shoulders bled. They would sit in the Pacific Ocean at night, linked arm in arm with their classmates, while hypothermia slowly shut down their bodies. And throughout this ordeal, the instructors would offer them one simple escape. A brass bell hung in the center of the training compound. Ring it 3 times, and the pain would stop immediately. Hot coffee, warm blankets, a bus ride back to the regular Navy. Most men rang that bell. The ones who did not became something else entirely. But completing BUD/S was only the beginning. What awaited these survivors in Vietnam would test them in ways that even Hell Week could not prepare them for. The Mekong Delta was not a battlefield. It was a nightmare made physical. 9,000 square miles of rivers, swamps, rice paddies, and mangrove forests where the distinction between land and water ceased to exist. The temperature never dropped below 90 degrees. The humidity never fell below 90%. Diseases with no names killed more men than bullets. Leeches attached themselves to every exposed surface of skin. Snakes that could end a man's life with a single bite lurked in every bush and every tree. And somewhere in this hellscape, hidden among 4 million civilians, were approximately 80,000 Viet Cong fighters who knew the terrain so intimately that they could move through it blindfolded. The conventional American military hated the Delta. Army commanders avoided it when they could and complained bitterly when they could not. Marine generals requested transfers to any other area of operations. A 1967 assessment by Military Assistance Command Vietnam concluded that the Mekong Delta was essentially ungovernable by conventional military means. The swamps swallowed helicopters, the mud disabled vehicles, the humidity ruined weapons. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. But the men who would become known as the Green Faces did not see a nightmare when they looked at the Mekong Delta. They saw an opportunity, and what they did with that opportunity would change the nature of warfare forever. The transformation began almost immediately after the first SEAL platoons arrived in country. These men had been trained to operate in water. They had been trained to move silently. They had been trained to survive conditions that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers. The Mekong Delta, which paralyzed conventional forces, was exactly the environment for which they had been designed. But training alone did not explain what happened next. What happened next was a deliberate decision to become something that the enemy had never encountered and could not comprehend. Lieutenant Roy Boehm, one of the founding architects of the SEAL teams, had established a principle that would define everything that followed. He told his men that they were not going to fight the Vietnam War the way the Army fought it. They were not going to establish fixed positions and defend them. They were not going to conduct large-scale sweeps that announced their presence to every enemy fighter within miles. They were not going to call in artillery and air support and wait for the cavalry to arrive. They were going to become the environment itself. They were going to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. This philosophy required a complete rejection of everything the American military establishment held sacred. And the brass in Saigon absolutely hated it. The conflict between the SEAL operators and the military bureaucracy began almost immediately and never fully resolved. Commanders at MACV headquarters, men who had spent their careers climbing the ranks by following regulations and maintaining proper appearance, were horrified by what they saw when they encountered SEAL platoons in the field. These men did not look like American soldiers. They did not act like American soldiers. They did not show the proper respect for rank and protocol that the military demanded. SEAL operators grew their hair long because it helped them blend in with the local population. They stopped wearing boots because bare feet allowed them to move silently through the mud. They discarded their helmets and flak jackets and regulation web gear, anything that would slow them down or make noise at the wrong moment. They grew beards that would have gotten them court-martialed in any other unit. Some stopped wearing uniforms entirely, operating in nothing but shorts and ammunition belts. The brass demanded compliance. The SEALs refused. This was not adolescent rebellion. This was calculated tactical adaptation. Every modification the SEALs made to their appearance and equipment served a specific operational purpose. The long hair and beards broke up the distinctive outline of an American face. The bare feet allowed them to feel tripwires and pressure plates that boots would have missed. The minimal clothing reduced noise and allowed faster movement through water. The discarded helmets eliminated the silhouette that enemy snipers had been trained to identify. The results spoke for themselves. SEAL platoons were achieving mission success rates that conventional units could only dream about. They were gathering intelligence that was reshaping the entire understanding of enemy operations in the Delta. They were eliminating high-value targets that had evaded every previous attempt at capture or neutralization. But the numbers told only part of the story. Something else was happening in the Mekong Delta, something that would not show up in any official report but would prove more decisive than any tactical success. The enemy was becoming afraid, genuinely, deeply, psychologically afraid, and the SEALs were just getting started. The green face paint was originally nothing more than standard camouflage. Military forces around the world had been using face paint to break up the human silhouette since the First World War. There was nothing mystical about it, nothing supernatural. It was simply practical concealment for night operations. But the SEALs understood something that the men who designed the camouflage never considered. In the villages of the Mekong Delta, where ancestor worship and spirit beliefs had shaped culture for thousands of years, a man with a green face emerging from black water in the middle of the night was not merely a soldier. He was something else entirely. Something that existed outside the framework of normal human experience. Something that the deeply superstitious Vietnamese population had no way to understand. And the SEALs deliberately cultivated this confusion with every operation they conducted. They began moving in ways that seemed impossible, emerging from rivers where no boat had been seen, appearing inside perimeters that had been watched all night, vanishing into terrain that offered no apparent cover. They carried weapons that made no sound. They struck without warning and disappeared without trace. They left behind no spent cartridges, no footprints, no evidence that human beings had been present at all. The Viet Cong intelligence apparatus struggled to explain what was happening. Their initial assumption was that these attacks were being conducted by South Vietnamese special forces or provincial reconnaissance units. But the pattern did not match. ARVN units did not operate with this level of precision. They did not move in such small groups. They did not possess the weapons or the training to execute these kinds of missions, and they certainly did not emerge from the water itself. The first reports of _4_ began circulating through VC networks in late 1966. At first, the political officers dismissed these reports as superstitious nonsense. The revolution was built on materialist ideology. There were no demons. There were no spirits. There were only imperialist soldiers who could be fought and defeated like any other enemy. But the reports kept coming, and the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Green faces, silent movement, weapons that made no noise, targets eliminated without any survivor able to explain what had happened, men who seemed to appear out of the rivers themselves and disappear back into them like the spirits of the drowned. Within months, the dismissive attitude of the political officers had changed completely, because the men with green faces were not just eliminating targets. They were eliminating the enemy's will to fight. The psychology of fear is not complicated. Human beings are hardwired to fear what they cannot understand. Darkness triggers fear because it removes our ability to see threats. Unfamiliar sounds trigger fear because we cannot identify their source. The unknown is inherently terrifying because it cannot be prepared for, cannot be defended against, cannot be predicted. The SEALs weaponized every aspect of this psychology with systematic precision. They operated exclusively at night because darkness multiplied the psychological impact of their actions. An attack that would be merely dangerous in daylight became terrifying in darkness. The enemy could not see how many attackers there were. They could not see which direction the attack was coming from. They could not see their own comrades falling. All they could perceive was noise and muzzle flash and the sudden disappearance of men who had been standing next to them moments before. They used suppressed weapons whenever possible, because the absence of gunfire created confusion that amplified fear. A man who is shot in conventional combat knows immediately what has happened. He has heard the crack of the rifle, seen the muzzle flash, understood that he is under attack. But a man who watches his comrade collapse silently in the darkness has no framework for understanding what he has witnessed. Was it a sniper? A booby trap? A sudden medical emergency? The uncertainty itself became a weapon. They struck at specific individuals rather than engaging in mass combat, because targeted elimination created a different kind of fear than battlefield casualties. When a soldier is lost in conventional fighting, his comrades understand that war is dangerous and random death is always possible. But when a specific person is removed from a specific location with surgical precision, the message is entirely different. The message is that the enemy knows exactly who you are, exactly where you are, and can reach you whenever they choose. This was not accidental. This was not the natural byproduct of effective tactics. This was deliberate psychological warfare, planned and executed with the same attention to detail that the SEALs applied to every other aspect of their operations. And it worked beyond anyone's expectations. By 1967, captured documents revealed that the Viet Cong Provincial Command had issued specific warnings about the _5_ operating in the Delta. These warnings described the green faces as _6 and _7. They noted the enemy's ability to move through water without making sound, their preference for night operations, their use of weapons that produce no noise. But the most significant portion of these warnings was the recommended response. Viet Cong cadres were advised to avoid direct confrontation with these units at all costs. If contact was made, immediate withdrawal was the only acceptable response. Standing and fighting was explicitly prohibited. Think about what this means. The Viet Cong had spent years developing tactics specifically designed to defeat American military forces. They had studied American patrol patterns, American communication methods, American response times. They had built an entire insurgency around the premise that guerrilla fighters with local knowledge could always defeat foreign soldiers who did not understand the terrain or the population. And now they were issuing orders to run away. The psychological impact cascaded through the entire insurgent infrastructure. Tax collectors, who were essential to funding Viet Cong operations, began refusing assignments in areas where the green faces operated. Political officers, who maintained control over the civilian population through a combination of persuasion and intimidation, found that their intimidation meant nothing compared to the terror of the water demons. Village chiefs who had been cooperating with the VC suddenly discovered that cooperation with the Americans might be the safer option. The Viet Cong were losing control of the Mekong Delta. Not because they were being outfought in conventional terms. Not because American firepower was destroying their forces. They were losing control because their own people were becoming more afraid of the green faces than they were afraid of the revolution. But the SEALs were not satisfied with creating fear. They wanted to create a legend. And they were about to succeed beyond their wildest imagination. The Ace of Spades became the first signature of the green faces. Though it was never officially authorized, and no documentation exists establishing when or why it began. SEAL operators started leaving the card at the scenes of their operations, tucked into the clothing of eliminated targets or pinned to the walls of destroyed structures. The card itself had no inherent meaning, It was simply a playing card, available in any deck. But the Viet Cong did not see a playing card. They saw an omen. Vietnamese culture is saturated with beliefs about luck, fate, and supernatural forces. The number 4 is considered unlucky because its pronunciation resembles the word for suffering. Certain animals are harbingers of fortune or disaster. Dreams carry prophetic significance. The spirits of ancestors watch over the living and can be angered or appeased through proper ritual. Into this framework of belief, the Ace of Spades arrived like a curse made physical. The card was black, the color of darkness and death. Its shape suggested a spear point or an arrowhead. It appeared without explanation at scenes of inexplicable violence. VC fighters began to believe that receiving the Ace of Spades meant you had been marked for elimination by the water demons. Some believed that merely touching the card would bring misfortune. The SEALs did nothing to discourage these interpretations. They encouraged them. They began leaving other signs as well. Footprints that led from the water to a target and back to the water, suggesting that the attackers had emerged from the river itself. Equipment deliberately discarded to prove that the green faces had been present in locations the enemy believed were secure. Sometimes they left nothing at all, which was even more terrifying because it suggested that the water demons could come and go without leaving any trace whatsoever. The psychological warfare campaign fed on itself, growing more powerful with each operation. Every successful mission added to the legend. Every eliminated target proved that the green faces could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Every survivor who fled rather than fight spread the terror to new districts, new provinces, new units that had not yet experienced the green faces directly, but had heard the stories. And the stories grew with each telling. By 1968, the mythology surrounding the green faces had expanded far beyond anything the SEALs had deliberately created. Viet Cong fighters in the Mekong Delta believed that the water demons could see in complete darkness. They believed the green faces could hear conversations from hundreds of meters away. They believed these Americans could smell the presence of enemy soldiers through the thick jungle humidity, tracking them by scent like animals. None of these abilities were real. The SEALs were exceptional operators, but they were still human beings with human limitations. They used night vision devices when available, but the technology of the era was primitive and unreliable. They relied on intelligence from local informants, not supernatural hearing or smell. Their seemingly miraculous ability to locate specific targets came from the CIA's Phoenix program, which had compiled detailed dossiers on thousands of suspected VC operatives. But the Viet Cong had no way to know this. From their perspective, the green faces possessed capabilities that could not be explained through normal means. They appeared where they should not be able to appear. They knew things they should not be able to know. They accomplished missions that should have been impossible. The only explanation that fit the observed facts was that these were not ordinary men. This belief had concrete tactical consequences. VC units in the Delta began altering their behavior in ways that degraded their operational effectiveness. They stopped moving at night, conceding the darkness to the enemy. They abandoned positions near rivers and waterways, the very terrain that had always given them advantage over conventional American forces. They increased the size of their security details, which made them more visible and easier to track. They became so focused on defending against the green faces that they neglected other aspects of their insurgent operations. Fear, it turned out, was a more effective weapon than any bomb or bullet. But the psychological campaign was about to receive its most dramatic validation, and it would come not from a SEAL operation, but from the enemy's own actions. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is remembered as a turning point in the Vietnam War, but not for the reasons most people believe. Militarily, Tet was a catastrophic defeat for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. They launched coordinated attacks against more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, hoping to trigger a general uprising against the American-backed government. The uprising never materialized. The attacks were repulsed with devastating casualties. The Viet Cong infrastructure that had taken years to build was largely destroyed in a matter of weeks. But in the Mekong Delta, something remarkable happened. Or rather, something remarkable failed to happen. The VC forces in the Delta did not participate fully in the Tet Offensive. While their comrades were launching suicidal attacks against heavily defended urban targets throughout the country, many Delta units held back. They conducted limited operations, often against secondary targets, and quickly withdrew to their base areas. The official explanation, offered by VC commanders after the war, was that communication failures prevented proper coordination. The attacks were supposed to be simultaneous and overwhelming, but the Delta units received their orders late or not at all. This explanation is almost certainly false. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from the period tell a different story. Delta VC units were not suffering from communication failures. They were suffering from a collapse of morale so severe that many fighters simply refused to participate in operations that would take them out of their base areas. The reason given, repeatedly and consistently across multiple sources, was fear of the green faces. The VC leadership had ordered their forces to mass for coordinated attacks, exactly the kind of movement that would make them vulnerable to SEAL interdiction. Fighters who had spent months hiding from the water demons, avoiding the rivers, staying away from areas where the green faces operated, were suddenly being ordered to move through those areas in large groups that would be impossible to conceal. Many of them refused. Some deserted. Others participated only nominally, conducting brief attacks and immediately retreating to the relative safety of their jungle camps. The green faces did not prevent the Tet Offensive, but in the Mekong Delta, they may have prevented it from being far worse than it actually was. The integration of SEAL operations with the Phoenix program created a synergy that neither element could have achieved alone. The CIA provided intelligence, names, locations, networks, vulnerabilities. The SEALs provided the capability to act on that intelligence with speed and precision that no other force could match. Together, they created a machine for dismantling the Viet Cong infrastructure, one carefully selected target at a time. The moral implications of this partnership have been debated for decades, and will likely continue to be debated for decades more. Phoenix was not a conventional military program. It was a targeted elimination campaign that operated in the gray zone between warfare and assassination. The targets were not enemy soldiers on a battlefield, but political operatives, tax collectors, intelligence agents, village-level organizers who had never carried a weapon in their lives. Critics have called it murder. Defenders have called it necessary. The truth, as always in war, exists somewhere in the murky space between these positions. But what cannot be disputed is the effectiveness. The VC infrastructure in the Mekong Delta was systematically degraded through Phoenix operations. Tax collection, which funded the insurgency, became nearly impossible in many districts. Political control, which maintained popular support for the revolution, was disrupted as the cadres who exercised that control disappeared one by one. Intelligence networks, which allowed the VC to anticipate and evade American operations, were compromised as their members fled, surrendered, or were eliminated. And throughout this process, the psychological impact of the green faces continued to multiply. Every successful Phoenix operation added to the legend. Every targeted elimination proved that the water demons knew exactly who you were and exactly where to find you. Every disappeared cadre sent a message to every other cadre in the region. You could be next. The surrender rate among VC operatives in the Delta increased dramatically during the Phoenix period. Many of these surrenders were never officially recorded, because the individuals simply stopped their VC activities and returned to civilian life without formally defecting. They did not want to be prisoners. They did not want to be collaborators. They just wanted to stop being targets. The fear had become so overwhelming that it was easier to abandon everything they believed in than to continue living under its shadow. The weapons carried by SEAL operators contributed significantly to both their tactical effectiveness and their psychological impact. Unlike conventional soldiers, who were issued standard weapons and expected to use them without modification, SEALs had extraordinary latitude to select and customize their armaments for specific mission requirements. The Stoner 63 light machine gun became perhaps the most iconic SEAL weapon of the Vietnam era. Designed by Eugene Stoner, the same engineer who created the M16 rifle, the Stoner 63 was a modular system that could be configured as a rifle, a carbine, or a belt-fed light machine gun depending on mission needs. SEAL operators favored the machine gun configuration because it provided devastating firepower in a package light enough for one man to carry through the swamps. A single SEAL with a Stoner could deliver more sustained fire than an entire conventional rifle squad. In the close-range ambushes that defined Delta operations, this firepower advantage was often decisive. Enemy forces that expected to face a small patrol would suddenly find themselves overwhelmed by a volume of fire that seemed impossible from such a small group. But the weapon that truly embodied the green face mystique was the Mark 22 Model 0, known by its classified nickname as the Hush Puppy. This modified Smith & Wesson pistol was equipped with a suppressor so effective that its report was reduced to a sound no louder than a hand clap. The weapon was designed specifically for eliminating sentries and guard dogs without alerting the main enemy force. The psychological impact of suppressed weapons cannot be overstated. In conventional combat, the crack of gunfire provides crucial information to both sides. Soldiers know they are under attack. They can estimate the direction and distance of the enemy. They can coordinate their response. But when targets begin falling silently in the darkness, all of this information disappears. The surviving enemy fighters have no idea what is happening, where the attack is coming from, or how many attackers they face. The Hush Puppy made the green faces seem supernatural. Men would collapse without any apparent cause. Bodies would be discovered at dawn with no evidence of how they had been eliminated. The VC began to believe that the water demons could reach through the night itself and simply take lives without any weapon at all. This was exactly the effect the SEALs intended. The tactical methodology developed by SEAL platoons in Vietnam would eventually be codified as the foundation of modern special operations doctrine. But in the 1960s, it was revolutionary. No military force in history had operated the way the Green Faces operated. A typical SEAL patrol began after sunset, when the darkness that terrified conventional soldiers became the SEALs' ally. The team would insert by small boat, by helicopter, or simply by swimming to their objective. They moved in absolute silence, communicating only through hand signals that had been practiced until they were second nature. They carried no identification, no unit insignia, nothing that could connect them to any specific command if they were captured. The patrol formations were designed for the specific terrain of the Mekong Delta. Unlike conventional infantry, which moved in files or columns that could stretch for dozens of meters, SEAL teams compressed into tight formations that could pass through the narrowest jungle trails without separation. Point men carried shotguns for close-range encounters. Rear security carried stoners for breaking contact if the team was compromised. Everyone carried enough ammunition and water for extended operations because resupply in enemy territory was impossible. The approach to targets was conducted with a patience that conventional units could not replicate. SEALs would sometimes spend hours covering distances that could have been crossed in minutes, stopping frequently to listen, to smell, to feel the environment around them. They learned to detect the presence of enemy fighters through subtle cues that regular soldiers would never notice. The smell of rice cooking, the sound of a magazine being inserted, the almost imperceptible change in insect noise that indicated human presence. When they found their target, the violence was sudden, overwhelming, and brief. SEAL ambushes typically lasted less than 30 seconds. The first shots eliminated the primary targets. Suppressive fire pinned any survivors. The assault element moved through the killing zone to confirm results and collect any intelligence materials. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the team vanished back into the darkness. The entire operation might cover miles of movement, hours of approach, and weeks of intelligence preparation. But the actual engagement was measured in heartbeats. This was surgical warfare at its purest, and the enemy had no answer for it. The Viet Cong attempted multiple times to trap and destroy a SEAL team, to prove that the green faces were merely men who could be fought and defeated like any other enemy. These attempts consistently failed. The most documented effort occurred in April of 1968, when VC intelligence learned that a SEAL team would be operating in a specific area of the Cay Mau Peninsula. They assembled a force of more than 30 fighters, dug in along the expected route of approach, and waited with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The ambush was textbook perfect. The SEALs should have been annihilated. Lieutenant Joseph Carey's squad walked directly into the trap. What happened next became one of the most celebrated actions in SEAL history. Rather than retreating under fire, rather than calling for extraction, rather than doing any of the sensible things that tactical doctrine would recommend, Carey led his 6-man team in a direct assault on the entrenched enemy positions. The attack was suicidal by any conventional analysis. 6 men against more than 30, attacking uphill into prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. But the SEALs had advantages that did not show up in any order of battle comparison. They had superior training, they had superior aggression, and they had the absolute conviction that they could not be defeated. Carey himself was severely wounded early in the engagement when a grenade detonated near his position, destroying most of his right leg below the knee. He continued directing the assault from the ground, coordinating his team's movement and fire until every enemy position had been overrun. By the time extraction helicopters arrived, more than 21 VC fighters had been eliminated. The survivors had fled into the jungle, their ambush transformed into a disaster. For his actions that night, Carey would later receive the Medal of Honor. But the impact extended far beyond any individual award. The story of what happened on the Cay Mau Peninsula spread through the Viet Cong intelligence network within days. A 6-man American unit had not only survived an ambush by 30 fighters, but had destroyed the ambush force so completely that there were not enough survivors to mount a pursuit. Even when you knew the green faces were coming, even when you outnumbered them 5-1, even when you had them surrounded and outgunned, you could not defeat them. The legend was no longer just a legend. It had been proven in blood. The peculiar brotherhood that developed among SEAL operators in Vietnam was unlike anything that existed in conventional military units. These men lived together, trained together, fought together, and in many cases nearly perished together in conditions that created bonds no civilian experience could replicate. They called themselves _9_. They lived in forward operating bases that bore no resemblance to the relatively comfortable rear areas where other American forces were stationed. Their _10 were often nothing more than plywood shacks built on the riverbanks, surrounded by sandbags and concertina wire. They ate the same food as their Vietnamese counterparts. They bathed in the same rivers where they conducted operations. They became so attuned to the Delta environment that they could smell the difference between various types of vegetation, could hear the specific sounds of different birds and insects, could feel changes in humidity that predicted weather conditions hours in advance. Regular soldiers who encountered SEAL platoons in the field often found them unnerving. These were not the clean-cut American servicemen depicted in recruiting posters. These were wild-looking bearded figures who moved through the jungle like predators. They spoke in a cryptic shorthand that outsiders could not follow. They showed no interest in the petty regulations and social hierarchies that governed conventional military life. They seemed to exist in a different world, operating by different rules, answering to different standards. But beneath this intimidating exterior was a professionalism so intense that it bordered on obsession. SEAL operators cleaned their weapons multiple times per day, even when there was no visible contamination. They practiced their patrol formations until every man could move through the most complex terrain without conscious thought. They rehearsed their standard operating procedures until the team functioned as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. This combination of apparent wildness and absolute discipline was central to the green face identity. They had to look terrifying to intimidate the enemy. They had to be disciplined to survive in an environment that punished every mistake with lethal consequences. The balance was not always easy to maintain. Some operators struggled with the psychological demands of missions that blurred the line between warfare and something darker. Some found that they could turn on the predator mindset for operations, but had difficulty turning it off afterward. Some discovered aspects of themselves that they had never known existed and were not entirely comfortable with what they found. But the brotherhood held them together. When the mission was complete, when the boats returned to base, when the face paint was washed away and the weapons were cleaned and stored, the team was still there. Men who had saved each other's lives dozens of times over. Men who understood exactly what the others had experienced, because they had experienced it together. This brotherhood would last for the rest of their lives. Decades after the war ended, SEAL veterans from the Vietnam era continued to gather, to remember, to share stories that they could tell no one else. The bonds forged in the Mekong mud proved more durable than anything the war itself could destroy. The relationship between the SEAL teams and the conventional military establishment remained contentious throughout the Vietnam War, and in many ways has never fully resolved. The brass in Saigon never understood what the green faces were accomplishing, or how they were accomplishing it. The metrics that mattered to MACV headquarters, body counts, territory controlled, enemy units destroyed, did not capture the essence of what psychological warfare could achieve. A six-man team that captured one tax collector did not generate impressive statistics. The fact that this single capture might neutralize an entire district's insurgent infrastructure was invisible to commanders who measured success in tonnage of bombs dropped and square kilometers of jungle defoliated. This disconnect created constant friction. SEAL commanders fought endless bureaucratic battles to maintain their operational independence. They were forced to justify tactics that conventional officers found incomprehensible or distasteful. They were accused of being undisciplined, of being cowboys, of being dangerous loose cannons who cared more about their own glory than about winning the war. The accusations were fundamentally unfair. The SEALs were not undisciplined. They were differently disciplined, operating according to standards that the conventional military did not understand and could not apply. Their tactics were not reckless. They were precisely calibrated for an environment that demanded unconventional approaches. Their independence was not arrogance, it was necessity, because the decisions that mattered in guerrilla warfare had to be made in seconds, by the men on the ground, not by staff officers in air-conditioned headquarters buildings miles from the action. But the accusations persisted, and they had consequences. SEAL operations were sometimes restricted or cancelled, because they did not fit the conventional military's understanding of how war should be fought. Intelligence that could have been exploited was allowed to go stale, because approval processes moved too slowly. Opportunities were missed because commanders in Saigon could not bring themselves to trust the judgment of bearded, barefoot operators who refused to wear proper uniforms. The SEALs accomplished remarkable things in Vietnam despite this institutional opposition. One can only imagine what they might have accomplished with full support. The withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam beginning in 1969 brought an end to the SEAL presence in the Mekong Delta. The last platoons departed in late 1971, leaving behind a region that would fall to communist forces within 4 years. Everything they had built, the intelligence networks, the psychological dominance, the indigenous forces they had trained, was abandoned. The SEALs did not lose the Vietnam War. No one who examines the record can credibly claim that they were defeated in the Mekong Delta. They achieved tactical dominance over an enemy that had resisted every other American effort. They proved that psychological warfare could be as decisive as any bombing campaign. They demonstrated that small numbers of highly trained operators could accomplish what massive conventional forces could not. But the war was lost anyway. Not in the swamps and rivers where the green faces hunted. The war was lost in Washington, where political calculations trumped military realities. It was lost in Hanoi, where leaders proved willing to absorb casualties that American democracy could not sustain. It was lost in the fundamental mismatch between a limited war strategy and an enemy committed to total victory. The SEALs came home to a nation that did not want to hear about what they had accomplished. The Vietnam veteran, regardless of service or distinction, was not celebrated in America of the early 1970s. He was ignored, marginalized, sometimes actively despised by a society that wanted to forget the war ever happened. Many SEAL veterans never spoke of their service. They put away their medals and their photographs. They never told their families about the missions they had conducted or the brothers they had lost. The green faces disappeared from public consciousness as thoroughly as they had once disappeared into the Mekong night, but the legacy they created would endure. The lessons learned in the Mekong Delta became the foundation for modern American special operations. The Joint Special Operations Command, established in 1980, drew heavily on Vietnam-era SEAL doctrine. The expansion of naval special warfare in the following decades was guided by veterans who had learned their craft in the Delta. The establishment of SEAL Team 6, originally designated as a counterterrorism unit, was a direct response to the success of small unit operations in Vietnam. The tactical methodologies pioneered by the Green Faces can be traced directly to operations conducted decades later in theaters that would have been unimaginable to those original operators. The raid that eliminated Osama bin Laden in 2011 employed techniques that would have been familiar to any SEAL who served in the Mekong Delta. Small team insertion, precise intelligence targeting, overwhelming violence of action, rapid extraction. These were not new concepts in 2011. They were concepts that had been proven in the swamps of Vietnam 40 years earlier. But perhaps the most important legacy was conceptual rather than tactical. The Vietnam SEALs proved that the psychological dimension of warfare could not be ignored. They demonstrated that fear, properly cultivated and deployed, could be as effective as any conventional weapon. They showed that the enemy's belief about your capabilities might matter more than your actual capabilities. The Viet Cong believed the Green Faces were supernatural beings who could not be defeated. This belief was false, but its effects were real. Fighters surrendered. Operatives fled. Infrastructure collapsed. The psychological impact of SEAL operations far exceeded their physical impact. This lesson has informed American military thinking ever since. Modern special operations doctrine emphasizes the psychological effects of precision strikes. Counterterrorism strategy focuses on disrupting not just enemy capabilities, but enemy morale and cohesion. The understanding that warfare is ultimately about breaking the enemy's will, not just destroying the enemy's forces, can be traced directly back to the Mekong Delta. The Green Faces taught the American military that terror could be a tactic, and the American military has never forgotten. Nguyen Van Thao, the tax collector who surrendered rather than face the Green Faces, lived until 1997. He spent the last decades of his life in a small village near Mai Tho, far from the rivers where he had once collected taxes for the revolution. He never joined the Communist Party that ultimately won the war. He never held any position of authority in the new Vietnam. He simply existed, an old man with old memories, until his body finally gave out. Those who knew him in his final years reported that he rarely spoke of the war. But when he did, he never mentioned the bombing or the battles or the terrible casualties his side had suffered. He spoke only of the waiting. The endless, unbearable waiting for something to emerge from the water in the middle of the night. He said the Americans had many weapons. Bombs that could level cities. Artillery that could turn the jungle into a wasteland. Aircraft that could strike anywhere at any time. But only one weapon truly mattered. Only one weapon could not be countered or survived. They had made the darkness itself into an enemy. And against that enemy, there was no defense. The men who created that darkness, the bearded operators with their green-painted faces and their silent weapons and their terrifying reputation, have also aged now. Many have passed on. Others live quietly, their service still partially classified, their accomplishments still unknown to the general public. They are ordinary Americans, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, men who attend church services and complain about politics and spoil their grandchildren. You would not know them if you passed them on the street. But once, in another lifetime, in a nightmare landscape of rivers and swamps and endless darkness, they were something else entirely. They were the men with green faces. They were the water demons. They were the predators who taught an entire enemy army that the night belonged to someone else. The Viet Cong surrendered without a fight because they believed the Green Faces were coming for them. They were right to believe it, and that belief, more than any bomb or bullet or battalion in the American arsenal, is what made the Navy SEALs the most effective fighting force of the Vietnam War. The legacy lives on in every special operations command center around the world. It lives on in every precision raid against terrorist leadership. It lives on in every psychological operation designed to demoralize an enemy before the first shot is fired. It lives on in the fundamental understanding that warfare is not just about killing the enemy, but about convincing the enemy that resistance is futile. The men with green faces proved something that military theorists had debated for centuries. They proved that a small number of extraordinary men, properly trained and properly employed, could accomplish what massive conventional forces could not. They proved that the human element remained decisive even in an age of technological warfare. They proved that courage, skill, and psychology could overcome any numerical disadvantage. And they proved something else, something that the official histories rarely mention and the Pentagon has never fully acknowledged. They proved that Americans could out-guerrilla the guerrillas. They could own the night. They could become what the enemy feared most. The men with green faces did not just fight the Vietnam War. They demonstrated an entirely new way of fighting that would shape military thinking for generations to come. And in the Mekong Delta, in those endless rivers and swamps where the American military had declared victory impossible, they achieved something that no bombing campaign and no conventional operation could accomplish. They made the enemy afraid to fight. That is the ultimate legacy of the green faces. Not the missions completed, or the targets eliminated, or the intelligence gathered. Not the medals earned, or the sacrifices made, or the brothers lost. The ultimate legacy is simple. They proved that fear could be a weapon. And they wielded that weapon with a mastery that the world had never seen before. The Viet Cong called them the men with green faces. They called them water demons and death spirits. They called them nightmares made flesh. They were right about all of it.